Istanbul.
That was fancy.
Hello, that was fun. Hello, welcome everybody today. We're broadcasting live from Washington, D.C., Istanbul, Chicago, and perhaps some other places in the world to an audience that probably covers 8 or 9 time zones at the moment. We are here today on behalf of the Gulf International Forum to discuss the way forward for American foreign policy in Yemen. This is a complicated issue that has moved so fast that some of you more observant may have noticed that we had to change the title in the middle of our advertising for the event. By way of background, I don't have to provide too much for this audience. The Yemen civil war began in 2014 when the Houthi movement overthrew the transitional government that had followed the overthrow of Ali Abdullah Saleh's government at the time of the Arab Spring. Saudi Arabia found the new situation in Yemen intolerable and asserted that a Houthi victory would lead to a government in Sana'a allied with Tehran. Riyadh, together with the UAE and other GCC states, formed the Arab coalition that launched a military operation, claiming, as these military operations always do claim, that victory would be achieved in 2 weeks. Iran, which until then had only a relatively small relationship with the Houthis, escalated its involvement. For a relatively small investment, Tehran has mired Saudi Arabia in a costly and fruitless 6-year war. In 2015, President Obama agreed to provide intelligence and logistical support for the coalition as people believe in return for Saudi acquiescence to the nuclear deal with Iran. But even with U.S. support, the coalition has been unable to overcome Houthi resistance. President Trump initially increased U.S. support to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but without much result. The Trump administration, the last development just before the change of government in the United States, the Trump administration announced that it would designate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization on January 19, 2021, one day before Biden's inauguration. This presented an enormously complicated host of issues. Humanitarian organizations in many foreign countries denounced the designation as threatening aid to a population on the verge of starvation. Events are moving so rapidly, as I noticed, that we were forced to change the title of the panel in midstream. Newly confirmed Secretary of State Tony Blinken announced he is reviewing the terrorist designation, but cannot undo it with the stroke of a pen. It will take time. He has rolled back some of the implementing regulations, and I would hazard a guess personally that it will be reversed. But in the meantime, we have 5 very knowledgeable and distinguished panelists who will try to address the complicated issues facing the Biden administration in Yemen and in the larger Gulf region. The first speaker is and I will do the introductions as I introduce the speakers very briefly. You can find longer introductions on the announcement page, and I will ask each of the speakers to try and stay really hard within the 9-minute allocation of the opening statements, because we as a larger panel than normal. This is a very complicated and important subject, so I'm happy that we have a larger panel. Our first speaker is Dr. Abdulghani al-Iryani, senior researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies and a political and development consultant, has done research on constitutional reform, anti-corruption, governance, governing capacity, state building, and conflict management. He is in a number of international organizations, consulted with them, including the UN, World Bank, and more alphabet soup than I have time for. And he will give us an insight and set the stage for the situation within Yemen. Mr. Iryani.
The Theros. I'd like to start by. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Oh, thank you, Ambassador Theros. I'd like to start by setting the stage on the conflict, setting the conflict in its place. Many people believe that it's a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I'd like to dispel of that at the start, because it's not. The Houthis are strongly allied with the Iranians. They rely on them for military technology and training and planning and intelligence, etc. But they are not a pawn. They have their own agenda. They are a Yemeni movement, and they should be approached accordingly. In my conversations with the Houthi leaders, I got the distinct sense that they realize very clearly that they have no future without good neighborly relations, or even more warmer relations with Saudi Arabia. They realize very, very well that Yemen has no possibility of economic viability without good relations and cooperation with Saudi Arabia. So the conflict is basically a way of slow negotiation between the Saudis and the Houthis to reach an understanding. There is distrust. Of course, there are ideological factions within each side who will never agree to extend their hand to the other side. But I think the moderates from both sides are prepared and willing to make peace, but they need help. And I think the US is best positioned to help. The US has an interest in the security of Saudi Arabia, and this war will continue to, let's say, corrode Saudi stability and security and the legitimacy of the ruling family, and could cause over time serious problems for Saudi Arabia, for the region, and for the US. I think that the current approach, or rather the approach under the previous administration in the US, was to sell the Saudis the rope by which they will hang themselves. And I think that's not in the best interest of the US, and clearly not in the best interest of the peoples of our region. I think that if the US wants to prove its support of Saudi Arabia, they should take some, let's say, severe measures to bring the Yemeni and the Houthi and the Saudi sides to negotiation. I'm speaking mindful of the way that decisions are made in Saudi Arabia. It's a system of highly centralized decision making, and there is very little feedback from the technocrats to the decision makers. So any approach to help bring this war to an end must come from the highest levels of the US government to the highest levels of the Saudi government. And they should deal the Saudis a bit of tough love. They should stop the sales of arms. They should support the passage of a new UN Security Council resolution that is more constructive than the disastrous one that is now the foundation of UN approach to Yemen, which is 2216, which demands that Houthis surrender everything and go home. A constructive resolution will recognize the realities in the ground, will not only assist Yemenis go to negotiations and assist the Houthis negotiate with the Saudis, but also will see the Yemenis through a transitional period until Yemen is returned to viability, both economically and politically as a state. I think that if the US is willing to speak to the Saudis. This is the best time to give them the necessary guarantees so that they would be willing to extend their hand to the Houthis. Of course, they need to pressure the internationally recognized government to come to the table. They should also deal with another serious obstacle in the path of peace, which is the war economy, and that is to be approached by advising the Saudis to cut down on the funding that they provide to the warring tribes and to the government. And if that takes place, I am confident that the path to peace will be a little bit easier. Thank you.
Mr. al-Iryani, we'd now like to turn to Ambassador Barbara Bodine, who is a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy and director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Prior to joining the school, she had taught and directed policy task forces and policy workshop in the Persian Gulf region, including Iraq and Yemen, for 70 years at Princeton. She has served as a director of the school's scholars and the nation's service initiative, a fellowship program for students as well. Ambassador Bodine's 30 years of service in the Foreign Service were spent primarily on Arabian Peninsula and Greater Persian Gulf issues, specifically U.S. bilateral and regional policy, strategic security issues, counterterrorism, and governance and reform. She served as ambassador to the Republic of Yemen, and of great importance to me, she is actually a very good friend of mine as well. Ambassador Bodine.
Patrick. In fact, thank you for pulling together this panel to talk about what happens next with Yemen. Following my good friend Abdulghani is both a treat and a bit daunting, because he's basically said most of what I would want to say. To talk a little bit more about what's going on internally and whether or not we can get to a ceasefire, I think the important issue is not just getting to the ceasefire, and that will take tough love to the Saudis, and I think also working with the Emiratis, who were the second major combatant on the side of the government until they decided to pull out. And I think the Emiratis also understand that this conflict is not going to end militarily. It's going to have to end in negotiations. One thing that the U.S. can do going forward is that there has been a very diligent, persistent, not always successful UN Special Envoy, Martin Griffith. And I think that we need to put much more visible, meaningful, material support to his efforts. Another element of this conflict, and I think those on the outside who wish to see it as a very Manichaean conflict, a classic civil war with two sides, need to understand that this is really a circular firing squad. And you not only have the Saudis and the Houthi, you have some degree of Iranian involvement, much less than talked about, probably more than we know. You did have the Emiratis actively involved. And we also now have the Southern Transition Council based in Aden. And the Southern separatists do add a complication going forward. It's not entirely clear who they represent beyond the greater Aden. A while ago, sometime in the before times, they unilaterally declared their independence or self-governance. And many of the other Southern governments said, nah, we're not part of this. And so their challenge to Hadi, as well as their challenge to the Houthi, is a factor that's going to have to be brought into any peace negotiation, giving them due regard, but not giving them a veto over what happens next. I think one of the tragedies of this war, and there are so many, famine, cholera, COVID, destruction of cultural heritage. One of the other casualties of this war has been this fragmentation of Yemen. There was always a very strong sense of Yemeniness, which was one of the major centripetal forces which kept the place together, and that has frayed badly. There is much more of a sense of separatism, not just in the greater Aden area, but in the Hadramaut and in Mahra on the Oman border. And so weaving together the various parts of Yemen back into a functioning state that recognizes regional identities and regional differences is going to be one of the major challenges. It's not just a ceasefire. It's not just getting the guns to stop, but it's putting together a new economy, as Abdulghani talked about, but also putting together a new social contract, which allows Yemen as a country to move forward and Yemen as a state to be rebuilt. And I'm going to end there because we have so many panelists and a lot of questions, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bodine. I appreciate very much the point you made that non-participants in bloody civil wars like this one don't understand always the damage that is done to a society's coherence by this kind of internal conflict. It is not just the dead, it's not just the dead and wounded and the destruction of infrastructure and so forth, but it actually, this happened in Syria and Iraq, real damage to the coherence of a society. Our next speaker to address actually this and to give us a good picture of the humanitarian disaster, for want of a better term, that is happening in Yemen today as a result of these years of conflict. Dr. Mohammed Zaher Sahloul is a medical doctor that takes great pride in being from Chicago, a civic leader, influencer, a professional care, critical care specialist. But for our purposes, even more important, he is considered one of the world's experts on the humanitarian crisis in his homeland, Syria, and applying the lessons learned there to other disaster responses, especially Yemen. In 2020, Dr. Sahloul was awarded the Gandhi Award for Peace for his humanitarian work in Syria, and at the global level, he has also received many other awards, including the Heroes Among Us Award by the American Red Cross. Dr. Sahloul.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Theros, for the nice introduction. I'm humbled to be among this esteemed group and with my friend, Mr. al-Iryani from Yemen. Last time I was in Yemen, in Hadramaut, was in November of last year. We had a group of 22 physicians who came with MedGlobal to do training and building capacity and resilience within the healthcare communities in Yemen. And we were all, as always, I mean, that was my fourth visit to Yemen. I visited Aden and Ma'rib and Hadramaut. I wanted to go to Sana'a, but it was very difficult to get to Sana'a. The Yemeni people were always hospitable. We are indebted to them, as an Arab, my roots are in Yemen. And also this morning I drank coffee to keep me alert. And, I think all of us should make sure that we do something to help the situation in Yemen, either at the humanitarian or political perspective. Couple of months ago, my organization, MedGlobal, which has been helping to rebuild the healthcare system in Yemen and provide medical assistance in many areas that are controlled by all parties, published a report about the impact of COVID on Yemen. We called it a tipping point for Yemen's healthcare system, the impact of COVID-19 in a fragile state. And we quoted at that time Dr. Nahla al-Uraishi, which is a Yemeni pediatrician from Aden, which she said that COVID-19 shook the countries with advanced healthcare systems and services like the United States. What will it do to a country like Yemen that has lived in the shadow of war for 5 years? And as we all know, the situation in Yemen is labeled as the worst humanitarian situation in the world by the United Nations. Over the last 5 years, the healthcare system in Yemen has nearly collapsed. Over half of Yemen's 5,056 pre-war health facilities are functional. Many have been destroyed by attacks. We have a crisis of malnutrition. About 2.2 million Yemeni children are acutely malnourished, and about 460,000 suffer from severe malnutrition. 1 million pregnant women have malnutrition, which increase the risk for their babies after delivery. The World Food Program estimates that about 16 million Yemeni people wake up hungry every day, and that the absence of food assistance, that number will go up to 20 million Yemenis. About 80% of the population is in need of humanitarian aid, and more than 50% in acute need. Now, from the humanitarian perspective, the designation of Ansarullah or al-Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization will potentially worsen the humanitarian conditions, especially in the areas controlled by the Houthis, and also that will risk full-scale famine for the following reasons. First, it will increase the food prices in a country where estimated 16 million people, or 54% of the population, are already facing high levels of acute food insecurity. Secondly, the number of people facing food insecurity is expected to rise in the coming 6 months, even before this designation, and the designation will further accelerate this process. The majority of people facing high levels of acute food insecurity live in areas controlled by the Houthis. About 70% of the population, or 30.5 million people in Yemen, live in the areas controlled by the Houthis. And also, thirdly, it will intensify the conflict over stable front lines, more or less, over the past year or so, that could displace up to 900,000 people. Fourthly, which is something that we've witnessed in Syria and other places, that banking sector in particular will become more over-compliant, will try to prove over-compliance with the regulations, and it will exert what's called de-risking practices. And this is of great concern, as we have seen in Syria and other places, that de-risking will increase and banks may start to freeze the transfer of funds to Yemen. And fifth, it may affect the flow of remittances from Yemeni diaspora to their families in Yemen, which is the lifeline for many Yemeni families. And sixth, it will reduce aid funding and increase the cost and time it will take to deliver aid in a country where 80% of people rely on humanitarian assistance. And seventh, it will cause the business sector, especially importers and financial institutions, to withdraw from and limit their engagement with Yemen, and that will narrow the pipeline of hard currency which Yemen relies on to keep essential food and fuel and medicine flowing. Now, the waivers and the authorization and the exemptions that are authorized by OFAC and the Treasury Department, as we have seen in the last few weeks or a couple of weeks, are essential to help mitigate against the humanitarian impact of this designation. But the lessons that we've learned from previous cases have shown that the importance of their timelines and also the limitation of its impact on the general population in general. So the Treasury Department and OFAC have issued 5 licenses so far, general licenses 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. And in particular, license 13 permits all transaction with the Houthis that have been previously prohibited by the designation until February 26, 2021. So based on these factors and the fact that we expect the humanitarian situation to worsen in Yemen, we are calling actually as the larger network of NGOs that are working in Yemen and care about the Yemeni people and their welfare. First of all, we are calling the Yemeni government and the Houthis And if anyone who is participating in this endless war and senseless war is to halt hostilities nationwide and facilitate unhindered humanitarian access throughout the country and ensure respect for humanitarian principles, and also prioritize supporting healthcare workers and their protection, including through consistent support of the staff and protection of the healthcare worker. And we are asking our government here in the US to increase the humanitarian assistance to all of Yemen based on the need, and also to reinstate, which I'm happy that we have done that, our membership in the WHO, and also prioritizing the resolution of the conflict, and all donors government to fully fund the Yemen humanitarian response plan, which is not funded fully at this point. Less than 25 or 30% of the plan is funded, and work to ensure healthcare workers are supported and all humanitarian workers are supported and protected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sahloul. I sometimes might take some issue with your statement that the United States has an advanced medical care healthcare system, considering our own rollout, but that's a personal problem, not a commentary. There are other players in Yemen, not least of which are Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and to a degree Oman and others. And they are very important players in this drama. And I'd like to ask Dr. David DesRoches. He is currently the associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center of Security Studies at NDU. Prior to this, he was the Defense Department director responsible for policy concerning Saudi Arabia. Actually, it's all the countries of the Arabian Peninsula. And prior to this, he has served in the Office of Secretary of Defense as a liaison to the Department of Homeland Security, as senior country director for Pakistan, as NATO operations director, and as the deputy director for peacekeeping. And he has spent quite a good time in the peninsula. So I'd like to ask him if he could lay out some of the issues facing the other actors in this drama.
Thank you, Ambassador Theros. I have to start by noting that my remarks do not reflect the position of any U.S. government agency. And then I would like to note that I graduated from Ranger School, have never served in the Ranger Regiment. I am a Ranger. And if you think otherwise, drag your ass through Ranger School and we'll talk about it. So I want to address 4 points, and I'll do it briefly, inshallah, based on, first off, my experience as a civil servant in the U.S. government, and then based on what I hear from militaries in the region. And for context, this month so far, I've presented classes at 3 war colleges in the region in this month. So I'm involved in all of them. Currently, I'm running a night program with one regional military and then a program during the day with another war college in the region. So if I fall asleep during my remarks, that's why. So the first is one about policy and the specific perverse desire of policymakers, regardless of their party or their affiliation, to view policy as a tool, as a fine scalpel-like tool, as a thermostat that you can turn the temperature up and down in 1 degree increments. This is common to everybody. We've seen it militarily. For example, Lyndon B. Johnson in the Vietnam War thought that by increasing the number of bombing sorties over North Vietnam, he could bring them back to the table to negotiate or to negotiate on terms. More recently, we saw in the Obama administration during the Arab Spring when the Egyptian government, the Bahraini government were, in the view of the administration, overreacting to protests or the military was seeking too large a role in policy in the government in Egypt, putting holds on specific weapon systems with the idea that this would send a finely calibrated message that would lead to finely calibrated actions. In practice, I think that this is a conceit and it generally doesn't work. But we've seen this, as Mohammed noted, with the 5 waivers that were granted to the sanctions on the Houthis. This idea that, yes, we're going to sanction it, but we're well aware that sanctions are a blunt instrument, and that this blunt instrument will increase civilian suffering as well as elite suffering. And so we're going to have these 5 waivers for humanitarian purposes to mitigate that. In practice, it never quite works that way. And even the waivers themselves are finely calibrated. For example, one of the waivers is for the Red Cross, but it accepts the Iranian Red Crescent Society because the assumption is that that would just be a front for Iranian intelligence. So this is a general bureaucratic conceit that you can send finely calibrated policy messages and receive finely calibrated results. It doesn't quite work. The second is a general overview of sanctions. I worked on narcotics-related sanctions in the early days in the 1990s when I was in the drug czar's office in the Clinton White House. It's become more of a finely calibrated instrument, but it still is rough. There's a general consensus emerging around sanctions. First, sanctions are very effective when they're targeted at individuals. The increase of information technology and the increase of financial intelligence means that if you want to get a specific person, and in my day we were looking at narcotics traffickers and corrupt governmental officials who are enabling them. Sanctions are now much better at that than they were back in my day. And so individuals, that's fine. The problem is when you start to look at regimes, and particularly corrupt regimes, as the Houthis are. Notice I said regime, not government. What you find then is that sanctions, what they have the impact of affecting a population which is in effect held hostage by the corrupt government. And as sanctions increase, what you do with a corrupt regime is they are able to grab a greater percentage of a shrinking pie. As things become scarce due to sanctions, the rulers of the regime are able to increase their power because they control the means of production. And while I was logging on here, I noticed that the UN Group of Experts report was released just this morning, and it pointed out that indeed the Houthis have been diverting humanitarian assistance. So the sanctions will do this. Now, the policy question is, does the implementation of sanctions, does it cause more damage on in the light of the sanction imposed or hostage population, or on the regime that needs to be sanctioned? We collectively in the West viewed that in some instances that damage is worth it. And the best example of that is the economic sanctions on the apartheid ring in South Africa. Obviously, though, I think that this is still an unresolved issue, even among the outgoing Trump regime, hence the 5 licenses that we spoke about. Now, my third point is the Arab view of this, and I'm speaking primarily for Saudis and Emiratis that I've worked with. Quite frankly, they will welcome the UN report of experts. It confirms what we know, and it confirms their worldview, which is basically the Houthis hold Yemen hostage. I think there is a realization, as Dr. Abdulghani said, that the Houthis are not puppets of Iran. They are proxies, but it's an indirect proxy relationship, as any relationship between an ally and a supported country is. But it's viewed as more under the control of Iran, and that Iran has, through the provision of weapons, the ability to allow the Houthis to spread mayhem throughout the region. So to that extent, I think that our Arab regional partners will welcome anything that decreases the ability of the Houthis. And they will point out, as my cursory glance of the just released UN report notes, that humanitarian aid has been diverted by the Houthis to their supporters away from people who suffer greater humanitarian trauma in order to strengthen the rule of this. So to that extent, it has become a tool in the use of it. The second thing I think they will point out is that it's important to realize that the Houthi claim to power has come exclusively via military prowess in violation of existing UN UN resolutions. Of course, as Abdulghani pointed out, that UN resolution is really a maximalist position in favor of the Hadi government and Saudi and Emirati interests. And then finally, I think that there will be some recognition that the physical manifestations of this narrative that the population of Yemen is held hostage to one small faction which illegally seek power. There are elements of that resonate in the West, particularly the denial of access to the offshore tanker, which is deteriorating and which, if it breaks up or when it breaks up, will lead to a region-wide environmental damage in the Red Sea. The fact that it's still proven to be impossible to get unimpeded access for the purposes of quarantining that ship and drawing the cargo of oil off of it to present it. That's seen as evidence of bad faith. Now, my final point is what does this mean going forward with Joe Biden? And I had a conversation with the general officer just yesterday in which he laid out two of the factors which I think are of great concern. The first is, I think that our Arab partners in the region, particularly the partners who are engaged in operations in Yemen, view the Biden administration with great suspicion as a rerun of the Obama administration, which in their view, not necessarily my view, made concessions on behalf of the Arab states' security without consulting the Arab states' security. And they're looking at the remarks, and I must say that there are two great remarks in the last 10 years that have translated imperfectly into Arabic and fed an uncomfortable narrative. The first is the Obama administration, or President Obama's interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, where he said, this is not an exact quote, that the Arab states need to learn to share with the Iranian, need to compromise with Iran for peace. I know what he meant. What he meant is, look, this needs to be like Paraguay, Bolivia, where, you guys have grievances, but it doesn't always come back to us, and you don't expect us to be on the ground with military assets to resolve it in one way or the other. But compromise, I think, was translated in the region, or at least it was taken to mean in the region, compromised in the sense that an intelligence operative is compromised when he's found to, have an affair with another agent. That it means you have to degrade your security interests or sacrifice your security interests, and that is prevalent today. 5 years after, 6 years after that remark was made. So the second concern is one of personnel, and the Ronald Reagan quote that personnel is policy, that is believed in the region by our partners, and they are looking at the people who are involved with this with great skepticism. They welcome the fact that if John Kerry's brought back in the administration, it's doing climate control, where presumably he won't have a hand in Iran relations, but the person of Rob Malley is just subject to universal concern, and I think that this will increase. So I see facts being brought up, such as the fact that his father was one of the founders of the Egyptian Communist Party, his involvement in the JCPOA negotiations, even an Iranian news agency report that quotes Washington think tank people who I have great respect for, guys like Elon Goldenberg, speaking favorably of Rob Malley. That is seen as proof. The fact that it was published in an Iranian thing is seen as proof that he is skewed towards Iran. So to summarize and conclude, this idea of finely honed sanctions is a fallacy that basically applies to all policymakers. It is inevitable that if sanctions persist, there will be humanitarian damage to the broader Yemeni population, which continues to suffer. That is not necessarily the fault of the sanctions. There is some blame to the Houthis, as the UN report points out. But our Arab partners see just bad faith across the board. And so they will probably, they've welcomed the imposition of sanctions, and they will view any relief of the sanctions as a lessening of U.S. Commitment and a further step on the road to what they see as a possible betrayal. And I welcome your questions.
David, thank you so much. That I agree with you completely. A friend of mine once said, talking to OFAC, that sanctions have the same scalpel-like quality as a B-52 raid. And finally, to sort of wrap this all up, and where is the United States going? Another dear friend, Ambassador Ronald Neumann, currently the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, a very distinguished organization. I say that because I belong to it as well, that assists the Department of State today in many issues, particularly in how it's organized and how it wants to move forward. Formerly Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, served 3 times. He was ambassador to Algeria, to Bahrain, and finally to Afghanistan, another easily solvable problem from July 2005 to 2007. And among other posts, originally, Ron was also deputy chief of mission in Sana'a in Yemen. Where's America going, Ron?
I was afraid I was going to be the sweep up on this horrible question. When you asked me to do this, Pat, you posed a couple of questions. One, whether the Pompeo sanctions are going to seriously impede the Biden administration going forward, and the other about whether Biden's wish to restore the Iran nuclear agreement, JCPOA, will affect this. On the first, I think my guess is that the Pompeo sanctions will impede, but not for a long time, the Biden administration. The congressional sentiment against the humanitarian problems of Yemen is so strong that I think that will tend to outweigh the Arab concerns that Professor DesRoches was quite correctly talking about. And so the legal impediments will be there, and that's why you see a 30-day decree, but it is going to take them time to work their way through and unwind and figure out what they're going to do. I think they will, in fact, relate or lighten the humanitarian impact of the sanctions. The other, though, I would say it is more that the search for agreement with Iran is likely to influence what can be done in Yemen than the other way around. Because as they move into this discussion with Iran, the administration is going to be aware of the great suspicion in which they're held. They have to not only consult about these issues with their Arab friends, who sometimes we're capable of ignoring, but they're going to have to consult with the Israelis, where we're not capable of ignoring their concerns. And the Israelis have an increasing ability as well to use their Arab relations, not in a negative way, I don't mean manipulate, but simply to work through that channel as well. They're going to have in fact, they're going to have some common concerns. They may not be expressed in a common dialectic, but they will be very related. So the Biden administration is going to have to figure out how it pursues its desire to get back into the Iran nuclear agreement in a way that takes some account of all of these other concerns. And that means, particularly in the Saudi case, a limit to how many other Saudi interests they can just ignore or stomp on. And I think everybody on this panel is much more experienced in Yemen than I am after these years of being on other issues. But, I think it's always useful to remember with the Saudis that their suspicion of Yemen goes way back to Abdulaziz. It isn't just a function of the Iranian involvement. That's just frosting on the cake. Secondly, that Iran's influence in Yemen, while it is never dominated to the extent that I think many American political figures have spoken about, the Iranian influence is larger than it was, and the Saudis have helped make that happen by their approach to the war. But that means that this will then be an issue that Congress, as well as the Saudis, will be looking at as you seek a peace solution. How are you going to do this and not, quote unquote, strengthen the Iranian presence in Yemen? So the need to deal with Iran and the need at the same time to deal with the sensitivities and the genuine security threats felt by our Arab friends in the Gulf, I think is likely to impact the Yemen problem, because I'm guessing, I could be wrong, but I could easily be wrong, but I think that when these things are weighed, the relative interests of the Iran deal and of our Arab friends are going to outweigh our interests in a Yemeni solution, not completely, but they will impede it. So in that respect, I think our pursuit of other interests will definitely have an effect. I may be wrong, I may be exaggerating it. I mean, these are things to see as we go forward. But I put them out on the table because I think it's useful to remind viewers of how interrelated these issues often become. Specialists and people very engaged in a particular issue tend to focus on that one with kind of laser-like force and either minimize, ignore, or don't pay attention at all to these other complications. But for the policymakers, they will impact. So let me stop there to respect the time, and I will go on to questions, and I think others will probably have much more to say than I do, but happy to be on this very interesting panel with a number of old friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. It's you paint the sort of gloomy picture that I have sometimes. Let me take advantage of my authority as moderator to ask a couple of my questions before we get on to some of the others. We've all spoken of of getting the Saudis and the UAE out of participation in the civil war, of getting the Iranians out of participation in the civil war. So I have a two-part question for any and all of you. First of all, what will it take to get everybody to sort of pull back, to decide that they're no longer involved? I'm talking about the Saudis and the UAE on one side and the Iranians. And two, what is the likelihood that the Yemeni parties will then slow down or stop their own civil war? I am reminded of one favorable example. My first assignment was Saudi Arabia in 1963 and in Jeddah, and I remember that we were at sort of the focal point of Saudi support and Egyptian support for two different factions in the civil war in Yemen at the time. Well, oddly, when the Egyptians pulled out of Yemen in 1967, the revolutionary cause, the civil war stopped, and the Egyptians were opposing collapsed. So I've never, Yemen is a different country that has its own idiosyncrasies. Does that have any relationship to what would the effect be if the outsiders stopped fighting? Barbara.
Thank you. The short answer to your second question is if everybody went home, the war would not end immediately or neatly. But the combatants might shift a little. As Abdulghani pointed out, the Houthi are not a creation of Iran. They certainly benefit from the relationship. They're not proxies. And so the Houthi could continue to fight if they so choose. The Hadi forces are far more dependent on Saudi Arabia. So you have the Saudis deeply involved, the Iranians sort of involved, the Houthi very able to continue on their own. The Hadi government would probably collapse pretty quickly. One of the unknowns is how far the Emirati trained forces and the Emirati funded political forces, how strong they would be going forward. I think it's important to note that the Emiratis have pulled out largely most of their military, and it's mostly a political relationship. And Iran, I do take a little, I have a slightly different view than my friend Ron, that if you really wanted to curb the Iranian influence in Yemen, or at least keep it from growing, one of the best ways to do that is to end the war. That as long as the war continues, Houthi dependence and Houthi alliance with Iran only continues. So to get Iran out in the war. But I think we do need to understand that the civil war would continue, but the level of destruction, the intensity of the humanitarian, all of that could be begun to resolve if the three major regional powers were to turn this over to the Yemenis and favorable outside powers to help negotiate a peace and a transition.
Anyone else want to toss in a question, an answer there, or a comment? David.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. So the question is really, what are the minimal demands of the UAE and Saudi Arabia in order to cease military operations? What would the situation have to look like for them to declare victory or accept defeat and withdraw? And so, it's important, I think, to look at what the initial Saudi war aims are. I think there were four. It was restoration of the Hadi government to secure their border, decrease the influence of Iran, and increase stability in the Bab el-Mandeb Red Sea littoral. Now, all four of those objectives are farther away now than they were at the start of the Saudi intervention. If they had taken the billions they've spent on that war, brought everybody in 2016 or 2015 to the national stadium and just set $3 billion on fire, they would have been better off than they are now. So the question is, what is the minimal thing accepted? And unfortunately, what I see here is a tactical problem I don't quite know how to do. I think it is that whatever the regime is, if it's Houthis or whatever, it does not have the ability to project offensive military power into the Saudi interior. Unfortunately, when you try to say, well, what does that mean? What it really means is that they will not have the ability to import offensive weapons, primarily missiles, from Iran. The implications of that means that the Houthis cannot control a port or an international airport because they are, the Iranian regime is experienced in transferring Revolutionary Guards and weapons via commercial airlines, whether they're labeled as humanitarian, commercial, or military. They've already they've been running an air bridge into Syria and Lebanon for decades now, or years now, and they can easily do it there. So the question is, how do you allow basically something to function as a state without having the ability to import, to control its airports and its seaports? And that, I think, is reduced to its most basic essence, the most basic problem that prevents the Saudis, at least, to make a peace settlement in Yemen.
Anyone else would like to chime in on that one? I have a follow-on to this discussion. What's in it for Iran? I mean, my impression, and it could be mistaken, was that the Iranians saw this as a peachy keen opportunity to make the Saudis really miserable. It's not that important to them. That they could walk away tomorrow and just leave some flags and declare victory and so forth. So the first question is, what's in it for Iran? Am I wrong? And secondly, why would any surviving Yemeni regime, be they the Houthis or otherwise, want to continue an offensive into Saudi Arabia?
Well, I do think, if I could just make a couple of comments. One is, this is such a, I totally agree with your characterization of Iran, but this is a frightfully convenient place for them, because now, as they deal with us, with the Saudis, this is something that they have almost infinite capacity to bargain about or not bargain about, because their actual interests are very low, but that means that it has huge transactional ability or utility for them. So what will they get out of it? I think what they have is an issue. The question is, how much can they milk this issue for other kinds of agreements they want? I think that's going to be the basis. And that gets you back to the problem you were talking about in the first question, which is, it's nice to say everybody should leave, but everybody has reasons for staying. And unless you can get to the very difficult point of having some political notion, some common view of what at least the external end game should look like, you just go in circles, meeting one party's criteria and being bounced off the other. So there is room for an awful lot of external discussion, I think, about whether there is enough overlap and enough common fear or things people don't want to have a basis. Otherwise, if one only starts to talk about withdrawal, at some point it gets too painful for somebody like the UAE, but then they find other ways to be involved. But otherwise, they're constantly calibrating in their head the pain of withdrawal versus the pain of whatever they're worried about. And even paranoids have real enemies, as they used to say, so that there's lots of room to re-engage if you only get people out on that kind of basis.
Mr. al-Iryani?
I have seen how the Houthis moved over the past 6 years closer and closer to Iran as their need for more advanced technology increased. So I agree with Ambassador Bodine that the only way to stop Iranian influence is to stop the war. And I believe that the Iranians, having this Yemen card fall in their lap with minimal effort on their part, they are hoping to trade it in for something more durable, for concessions in Syria and Iraq, or on the nuclear file or whatever. Nobody has agreed to negotiate with them. And I think they will be very receptive to an offer, a reasonable offer that will take them out of Yemen and allow the Saudis and the Houthis to start the kind of relationship that would secure the stability of both countries and prosperity of Yemen.
Let me go on to a question from the audience, and then we can get back to this discussion. The nightmare scenario might be the Secretary of State's inability to lift the sanctions in a timely manner, in a way to prevent the disaster in Yemen. How much time do we have to get the sanctions lifted before things turn even uglier than they are right now? And what would the consequences be? Dr. Sahloul.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we have exemptions, which it looks like the Treasury Department and the OFAC office have been granting, then that will give the access to humanitarian assistance to most Yemenis. I mean, we've worked through sanctions in Syria for a long time. For example, Al-Jabhat al-Nusra, which is one of the actors in Idlib, northwest of Syria, has been designated as a foreign terrorist organization. But because of the general license exemption and waivers, then we're able to provide humanitarian assistance to the civilians living in areas that are under their control, 4.2 million civilians. So exemptions are helpful, waivers are helpful. The unintended consequences of the sanctions, this is something that the community and the administration, the international community and the administration have to worry about, especially the de-risking practices by bankings and also the reluctance of a private sector to invest in Yemen or to provide import and export food and things like that. But I think the current waivers at least will give the administration some time to review the goals of the designation and whether it's a part of the general strategy of the administration to move forward in Yemen. One more point about Iran, this is me speaking as Syrian American, not as a humanitarian. We've seen what Iran has done in Syria, which is not very helpful. And the last 10 years of war have actually strengthened the hand of Iran in Syria, made it, they exploited the divisions and the sectarianism to have not only troops and militias imported from Afghanistan and Iraq and Lebanon and Pakistan to Syria to fight with the Assad regime that attacked basically civilians and so forth, but also to try to convert part of the population to what they believe that will be their interest in the future. So this is something that also we're seeing probably in Yemen. There was not much division between the Houthis or Zaydis and the Sunni Muslims in Yemen before, and many tribes and families have, I think, people from both sides. But because of the war and the exploitation by Iran of the war, we are seeing more sectarianism and division. And this is something that we have to pay attention to. And it will have long-term consequences on the welfare of the Yemeni and the Syrian and Iraqi communities.
Barbara.
The impact of the sanctions, and I do think that this administration is going to do whatever they can as quickly as they can to get them lifted, or certainly at least more targeted. But we tend to focus on the humanitarian impact, and it's significant and it's grotesque. The sanctions will also make it very difficult for Martin Griffith or anyone else who is working on the peace process. He can't even bring the Houthi to Geneva or someplace for talks because they can't fly on an airplane. And so while the humanitarian should be the focus of why the sanctions should be lifted, there is a very direct and immediate impact on peace talks, track 2 talks, anything that involves bringing someone from the 70% of the population that lives in Houthi areas and could be seen as material support to the Houthi. So that factor needs to be also on the table.
As part of the same question, again, we said that one of the things that the Iranians would do to negotiate or to pull out of supporting the Houthis would be something else. One of those something else's, for example, is giving the negotiating with the Iranians something that we have not been able to do or have wanted to do in the past, giving the Iranians something. What could we give Saudi Arabia? What would the Saudi Arabia try to trade the JCPOA for getting out of Yemen? Would Saudi Arabia want something else in the way of concrete military assistance? What could we give Saudi Arabia to sweeten the defeat of pulling out of Yemen? Anybody?
Okay. Well, the first thing that you give the Saudis is, a very large fig leaf, that they are not being defeated. They're not pulling out. And you at least give MBS the facade of some kind of victory. One thing that can be given, and it's already being worked on, and Abdulghani knows far more about this than I do, is that there is a very wide, what? Something happened?
No, you're here.
Okay. There's a very wide demilitarized zone already being created along the border, and to cut back on infiltration and to offset, any attacks on Saudi Arabia. So I think giving some kind of guarantees and helping with the demilitarization of the border region, possibly also to go back to an earlier point, not saying that the new government of Yemen does not have some control of its ports, but allowing some kind of inspection or monitoring regime that does not look like a blockade, but does at least give comfort on what's being shipped into the country. Those would be 2 things that could be given to the Saudis. Sacrificing the JCPOA for this? No.
Let me see the question. Does the political side, the one issue that has been mentioned briefly, but not much has happened, the Southern Separatist Movement, the STC, how does this play in this game? How does this play in bringing the war to an end? Does the Biden administration would it be willing to how can I say, put in a lot of diplomatic markers to prevent it from happening, or would it find it as a way of bringing the war to an end? Anybody? Barbara again.
Abdulghani? No, I was turning that over to Abdulghani to answer.
You're muted.
Am I on now?
Yes, you're on now. Thank you.
Yeah. We have taken into consideration the fact that Saudi and the UAE are at cross purposes. And unfortunately, both of them have been able to undermine and divide the front, the anti-Houthi front, to the point where the Houthi has come out of this confrontation supreme. I think that the Hadi government, Hadi is trying to monopolize the representation of the South, and the STC are doing the exact same thing. The Emiratis and the Saudis can lean on both sides and force them to have a real compromise. And if that does take place, there will be a front that could provide enough deterrence for the Houthis, so that when the external intervention is gone, then the anti-Houthi camp will be in a position to defend themselves.
We're beginning to approach our time for this. I wanted to add one comment of my own that one of the saddest developments of what has happened is I remember, Barbara, you should remember this as well. We were in counterterrorism. The Yemenis used to have very elegant ways of preventing people from getting killed when they had disputes. We had a couple of people from the embassy kidnapped a couple of times, and it turned out that somebody just wanted a bridge built or something like that. Whatever happened to that? What a sad development. But that's personal commentary. What I'd like to do is ask each of you to give us a couple of minutes of where do we go from now, and in particular, give me your odds on how soon and if we can bring, first of all, the withdrawal of the foreign forces, and secondly, something approaching peace in Yemen. Mr. Abdulghani.
Yes, I think that everyone is tired of this war. I'm not alone among Yemenis who believe that Yemenis are now ready to make peace with each other. But the obstacles to that are basically the war economy, which is funded by foreign actors and foreign interests. And I feel that if they are willing, if they declare a deadline for their withdrawal, that will, I think, push Yemenis much closer to an agreement.
Ambassador Bodine, Barbara.
Emiratis are already largely out militarily. The Iranians have never been in a major way militarily. So the question is the Saudis. I think the administration's already signaled that we may not provide support to these efforts. And I think Abdulghani's very good point that when we're talking about foreign interference, it's not just military, it's also the war economy. I think the pieces are there. I think the intent is there on enough sides. I'd say, if this administration takes seriously working with the Saudis, working with the Emiratis to work with the Saudis, understands that this is going to have a minor but still a role in the JCPOA reboot, with some good policy, some good diplomacy on our side, the view of the Yemeni people that they would like this to be over, and the continued work of Martin Griffith, I will be the ever optimistic diplomat with all the caveats that there were a lot of ifs in that.
Thank you, Dr. Sahloul.
Well, I mean, no one mentioned Russia and China, but I think they also bear responsibility. We're seeing especially the negative impact of Russian support of the regime in Syria. One of the things that I'm really worried about, the international also humanitarian community, is the blocking of the renewal of cross-border relief from Turkey to Syria by the Russian UN ambassador, as he pledged to do so. But also Russia and China have had tacit support to the Houthis. I don't think that they were helpful and throughout the conflict. The other issue is that we have to leave it to the Yemenis. We have in Arabic saying that al-hikmah yamaniya. That means the origin of wisdom is from Yemen. We had a recent conversation with doctors from Sana'a, from Aden, from Taiz, from Hadramaut and Ma'rib. And all of them are focused on the future and rebuilding their country and the healthcare system in their country. And I think if we leave it and listen to the Yemenis, that would be the best thing that we can do.
Mm-hmm.
David.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry we got to the subject of the war economy rather late. I think that's a whole panel there, but I can tell you that I have spoken to Arab officers who have fought in Yemen and referred to the Yemenis in this term of war mice. It translates as war mice. That there are people in Yemen who are invested, who are profiting from the ongoing war on both sides. And so perhaps one use of sanctions, one way to bring people to the table, is to target individuals on both sides who we think are continuing the conflict and opposing a possible solution, and letting them know that you can rake off $423 million from the central bank, as the Houthis are accused of doing, but that won't allow you to settle in London and buy a townhouse. And I think if you have that incentive at the elite level, then you can start to work your way through the problems at the bottom level. But again, that requires a lot of goodwill and optimism, and I'm not sure what the stockage is of that.
Thank you. Ron, the bases are loaded. You're up to bat. We're at the bottom of the ninth.
And you're going to get a single at best.
Bunt.
Those of you, my colleagues on this panel, who are a very knowledgeable group, have made it pretty clear just how complicated this thing is. Getting to solution in something that complicated, with that many outsiders, with that many interests, it's pretty hard to be optimistic that this is going to happen quickly, much as I would like to be optimistic. One of the big unknowns right now, though, and it is just an unknown, I can't speculate, is how much bandwidth the United States is going to have, to the extent that we need to be involved, which I think we do. We don't even know who the Assistant Secretary for the Middle East is going to be yet. We don't have key people appointed. I hope I'll be wrong. My guess, with no evidence, so that's the safest kind of guessing, it is that this is going to be really hard for the administration to focus on. That they just have too many other issues, and their focus will be episodic, and it'll come and go with crises, or when it intersects with the Iran negotiations or something else. But that getting the bandwidth, the focus time to have a really deliberate policy and work the policy, because this is the kind of thing where you don't have a policy, you have a goal, and then you have to spend enormous amounts of time talking to all kinds of people and reinforcing the efforts of others like Griffith and the UN, and that takes a lot of horsepower, because you have to not only put somebody on it, you have to have that person be seen to have access at the highest levels and have influence. And at this point, we have no idea. Will the Biden administration find the attention span and the combination of importance and delegation to play that role? But I have to be dubious until we see it unroll. And I'm sorry to end on such a low note.
Sadly, Arabia Felix seems to be a long stretch from now. It's a pity. It's a country with some of the nicest people I've ever met. One of my earliest friends was Mohammed Shahati. He and I, late governor of the central bank, he and I were freshman classmates at Georgetown much longer ago than I would care to remember. But a lot has been said here. I hope that we come away, our audience comes away with an understanding of the complexities and of the tragedy of Yemen. Thank you all very much. It has been a great panel, and I hope to see you all soon in other places as well. Thanks again.